On a Friday evening in December 1975, a 19-year-old newlywed was found stabbed to death on the living room floor of her Lancaster County apartment. A knife was still embedded in her neck. A tea towel had been wrapped deliberately around the handle. Grocery bags sat on the dining table. Unopened, she had just gotten home. Police interviewed 300 people, formed a task force, called in the FBI, and for 47 years, they had nothing. Until a genetic genealogist traced a single strand of DNA backward through 4 centuries, all the way to a village of 2,000 people in southern Italy, and followed it forward again to a man who had been living in the same county the entire time. This is the story of Lindy Sue Biechler, and the man who thought he had gotten away with it. Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, sits about 2 hours west of Philadelphia. In 1975, it was Amish farmland, tobacco fields, and quiet apartment complexes sitting right next to each other. Lindy Sue Biechler was 19 years old. She worked at a floral shop in Lancaster County. Her husband Phil later described her as extremely compassionate and unbelievably charming. They had gotten married about a year earlier and moved into a 4-unit apartment building called Spring Manor on Kloss Drive in Manor Township. Phil was 20. Lindy was 19. 2 young people building a small, ordinary life together. On December 5th, 1975, a Friday, Lindy ran some errands after work. She stopped at the bank to deposit their paycheck. Then she went to the grocery store. She came home with bags in both hands and set them down on the dining table. She never got to put them away. Sometime between 6:45 and 9 that evening, someone attacked Lindy Sue Biechler in the living room of that apartment. She fought back. The injuries on her hands and arms told investigators she didn't stop fighting. But her attacker had come prepared. He brought a knife with him. And at some point during the attack, he took a second knife from her kitchen. She was stabbed 19 times. In the neck, the chest, the abdomen, and the back. There was also evidence of sexual assault. At approximately 8:46 that evening, Lindy's aunt and uncle arrived at the apartment to exchange cooking recipes. They knocked. They went in. What they found in that living room stayed with them for the rest of their lives. One of them said in court decades later, "I've been to World War II, and I've never seen so much blood." Lindy was lying on her back on the floor. A knife was still in her neck. The wooden handle had a tea towel wrapped carefully around it. That detail mattered. This wasn't panic. This wasn't frenzy. Someone had taken the time, in the middle of killing a 19-year-old woman, to cover a knife handle so they wouldn't leave fingerprints behind. Someone who was still thinking clearly. Police found a man's footprint in the kitchen. They also collected one piece of biological evidence: semen DNA from Lindy's underwear. There was no technology in 1975 that could do anything useful with that sample. So investigators packaged it, labeled it, and filed it away. They treated it as the most important thing in that case file. They just had no way to use it yet. Phil Biechler was questioned and cleared immediately. He had been at work. Manor Township Police and Lancaster County investigators worked every angle they had. They interviewed close to 300 people, including neighbors in the building, co-workers at the floral shop, and anyone connected to Lindy's life. They formed a task force. They brought in criminologists from outside agencies. Nothing came back. The killer had left no fingerprints. The footprint in the kitchen led nowhere. The narrow time window of the attack, that gap between Lindy coming home and Phil being expected back, told investigators something important. This wasn't random. Someone knew her schedule. Someone knew she would be alone in that apartment right then. On the day Lindy was buried, Manor Township Police Chief Donald Sheeler said publicly, "We actually don't have a thing at this time." Then a letter arrived. Someone claiming to be the killer had written to investigators. Police reviewed it and chased it down. It led nowhere. The case went cold. In 1997, the DNA sample was submitted for laboratory analysis. In 2000, it was entered into CODIS, the National DNA Database. No match came back. The killer had no criminal record. His DNA wasn't in any system. That same year, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit reopened the case. Their conclusion: the killer almost certainly knew Lindy. The timing wasn't coincidence. Someone close. In 2005, the Vidocq Society got involved. The Vidocq Society is a Philadelphia-based group of more than 50 volunteer criminal experts, including forensic scientists, profilers, and former law enforcement, who take on unsolved cases at no charge. They gathered in Philadelphia specifically to review the Biechler murder. Still nothing. In September 2019, Lancaster County released 2 composite images generated from the DNA evidence. Parabon Nanolabs had used the genetic material to predict what the suspect likely looked like. Fair-skinned, hazel eyes, dark hair, Southern European ancestry, at age 25 and at age 65. Tips came in from the public. None of them went anywhere. The case had now been open for 44 years. Phil Biechler was in his 60s. He'd spent his entire adult life without an answer. And then something happened that would change everything. And it didn't happen in Lancaster County at all. In 2018, a man named Joseph James D'Angelo was arrested in California after more than 40 years on the run. He was the Golden State Killer, responsible for at least 13 murders and more than 50 sexual assaults across California in the 1970s and 1980s. And he was caught through a method that had never been used in a criminal case before: genetic genealogy. Instead of searching for the suspect's own DNA in a criminal database, investigators had searched for the DNA of his relatives in public genealogy databases. They built a family tree and narrowed it down to one person. When Phil Biechler read about the D'Angelo arrest, he had one thought. "I've been wondering," he said, "if the procedure they used to find Christie's killer was something they could use to find Lindy's." In late 2020, the Lancaster County Cold Case Unit contacted C.C. Moore, the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs in Reston, Virginia. Moore had worked on hundreds of cold cases. She had cracked some of them in as little as 2 hours. She uploaded Lindy's DNA file and began working. And then she hit a wall unlike anything she had encountered before. The closest DNA matches in the entire database, matches that in most cases would point to a cousin, a half-sibling, someone sharing a grandparent, were tracing back to the 1600s and 1700s. Common ancestors from 3 to 4 centuries ago. No usable branch. No individual genetic match close enough to follow. "Usually, I'm able to identify common ancestors," she said later. But because the common ancestors between the matches and the suspect in this case were probably back in the 1700s or 1600s, I wasn't able to approach it the way I do most cases. She was, by her own description, extremely disappointed. But she didn't walk away. She had known about the Biechler case for years. She had developed what she called a near obsession with it. She had even asked Lancaster County investigators to submit the case to Parabon herself, rather than waiting to be assigned. So she built something new. If she couldn't trace the suspect forward through DNA matches, she would trace the DNA itself backward, all the way to its geographic origin. She cross-referenced every distant match against each other. She pulled Ellis Island immigration records. She went through World War I and World War II draft registration cards. she studied migration patterns across generations. After months of work, every thread pointed to the same place: Gasparina, a village of barely 2,000 people in the Calabria region of southern Italy. From a laboratory in Pennsylvania in 2020, the trail had gone back 4 centuries to a small town at the southern tip of Italy. And now Moore had to trace it forward again, through generations of families who had left that village and settled in Lancaster County. She found the membership records of the local chapter of the Order Sons of Italy in America. These were cards kept by the Lancaster community listing the names, birth dates, and birthplaces of Italian immigrants in the county. Moore went through every family that had emigrated specifically from Gasparina. She eliminated women and anyone too old or too young to fit the suspect's age profile. The list got smaller and smaller. And then, in an old Lancaster County newspaper, she found an engagement announcement. 2 names and an address: Spring Manor Apartments, Closs Drive. That was a real stroke of luck that it was published, and he was at that address then. Moore said afterward, "It made him immediately jump out to me." The name in that announcement was David Vincent Sinopoli. David Sinopoli was 68 years old and had lived in Lancaster County his entire life. All 4 of his grandparents had been born in Gasparina. When investigators looked into his background, they found one prior conviction. In 2004, Sinopoli had pleaded guilty to invasion of privacy and disorderly conduct. He had been secretly watching a woman who was naked in a tanning room at a hair salon called Sissy's Hair Boutique in Mount Joy, Pennsylvania. He was sentenced to 1 year of probation and fined $100. Because it wasn't classified as a violent crime, it never appeared in any violent crime database. Nobody had ever connected it to anything. And then investigators found something that changed the temperature of the whole case. In 1974, 1 year before the murder, David Sinopoli had lived in that same 4-unit building at Spring Manor. The same building where Lindy and Phil Biechler lived. He had been their neighbor. Lindy would have known his face. Not one tip out of 300 interviews across 47 years had ever pointed to him. Investigators couldn't approach him directly. If Sinopoli knew he was a suspect, he'd have time to prepare, and they'd lose the only advantage they had. They needed his DNA on something he had voluntarily discarded, something no court could challenge. So surveillance began. Patient, quiet. They tracked his routine and waited. Then they learned that Sinopoli and his wife were flying out of Philadelphia International Airport. They were heading to Aruba on vacation with another couple. On February 11th, 2022, before sunrise, David Sinopoli sat at an airport coffee shop. He drank his coffee, and he threw the cup in the trash. Investigators were already there. They retrieved it. The cup was sent to DNA Labs International for testing. The results showed a single male DNA contributor. Those files were then forwarded to Cybergenetics, a Pittsburgh-based laboratory that specializes in separating DNA mixtures. Cybergenetics ran the comparison. The DNA on that coffee cup matched the semen collected from Lindy Sue Biechler's underwear on December 5th, 1975. The match statistic was around 1 in 10 trillion. On July 17th, 2022, at 7 in the morning, investigators arrived at David Sinopoli's home in East Hempfield Township. He was arrested without incident. It was 46 years, 7 months, and 12 days after Lindy Sue Biechler was murdered. The next morning, District Attorney Heather Adams stood before the press at the Lancaster County Courthouse. She said, "This case was solved with the use of DNA, and specifically DNA genealogy. Quite honestly, without that, I don't know that we would have ever solved it." And then, The reality is that David Sinopoli was not on our radar. None of the tips over the years had suggested him as a possible suspect. For the first time since December 5th, 1975, Phil Biechler had an answer. There was one person who didn't get to hear it. Detective Joseph Giese had spent decades as a Lancaster County investigator. He had worked both the Biechler case and the 1992 murder of a Lancaster schoolteacher named Christy Marak. His dying wish, his family said, was that both killers would be found. Joseph Giese died on June 26, 2018, the day before Raymond Rowe was arrested for Christy Marak's murder. He never knew either case was solved. David Sinopoli spent more than a year in Lancaster County Prison without bail. On October 19, 2023, he appeared before Lancaster County Judge David Ashworth. He had decided not to go to trial. Before the proceedings began, Assistant District Attorney Christine Wilson placed a photograph of Lindy Sue Biechler on a stand directly next to the defense table. Sinopoli would sit beside it for the entire hearing. Wilson turned to Sinopoli and pointed at the photograph. "These cases are never forgotten," she said. "Lindy Sue will never be forgotten. While the defendant was able to carry on with his life, Lindy was extinguished by him. Look at her, and the precious life you stole in 1975. Sinopoli glanced at the photo. His face didn't change. Not a single shift in expression. Phil Biechler stood and spoke directly to Sinopoli. "David Sinopoli," he said, "you took a huge part of my life from me and caused an extraordinary amount of pain and suffering for so many people. While others have had to live with the terrible consequences of the murder you committed, you got to live your life." Judge Ashworth addressed Sinopoli before accepting the plea. "The enormity of the damage you have caused is incomprehensible," he said. "The depravity of your actions cannot be overstated." He noted for the record that Sinopoli was pleading guilty because he had been caught, not out of remorse and not out of conscience. Then Sinopoli was allowed to speak. He said one sentence: "I would like to apologize to everyone, including my wife." No explanation for why he went into that apartment. No reason for the 19 stab wounds. Not a single word about December 5th, 1975. The only question Phil and Lindy's family and everyone in that courtroom actually wanted answered was why. And they never got it. Sinopoli pleaded guilty to third-degree murder, aggravated assault, and burglary. He was sentenced to 25 to 50 years in prison, the maximum allowed under Pennsylvania law as it stood in 1975. Sentenced under the law of the era he committed the crime, not the era he was finally caught. At 69 years old, David Sinopoli will die in prison.